Probably know where we're going this morning, but I want to ask anyways. What is the most important question that you can consider and ask of yourself? What's the most important question that you can ask yourself? Now, a lot of the questions we wrestle through in life, like what kind of job should I get if you're a college student graduating or even in the middle of life? You might be wondering, who should I marry? Where should I live? Should I be closer to grandkids? What do I do in retirement? There's all sorts of very important questions that we wrestle with through life, but really deeply, what's the most important question that you can ask yourself? I think there's a lot that would be in the contending for first place, but I think one near the top has to be, was Jesus the Christ raised from the dead? Genuinely one of the most important questions that you can ask yourself. Now, there's a lot of other questions that we can look at from history that just don't really have any bearing on our lives. You can wonder back, if you like history, did Paul Revere actually do a midnight ride to warn the colonists? The British are coming, the British are coming. If you like history, cool, you can wonder that question. But does it have much significance on your life today? Hardly at all. Not really. Nothing there. Just a fascinating question. Not so with Jesus being raised from the dead. This question has massive significance for your life. If Jesus was raised from the dead, death has been defeated. If Jesus was raised from the dead, there's more than just this world. If Jesus was truly raised from the dead, God is real, Jesus is reigning, there's forgiveness of sins, and Jesus is who he said he is. Everything changes if Jesus was raised from the dead. Impacts our lives. There's a great scholar named Gary Habermas, who's a scholar on the resurrection. His wife got stomach cancer back in the mid-90s, and he had to watch her slowly suffer in misery for months as she slowly died in massive pain. You know what was most helpful for Dr. Habermas to consider and think about? The resurrection of Jesus Christ. Though he'd spent his scholarly life looking at it and considering it, it was also the most helpful truth for him in his massive suffering and the suffering of his wife. This is not some dead historical theological question we're looking at. This is the hope of your life. Was Jesus raised from the dead? On the other hand, if Jesus was not raised from the dead, we are without hope, and our faith is useless. Look at what Paul says. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. He says this, "And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. More than that, we are then found to be false witnesses about God, for we have testified about God that he raised Christ from the dead." Verse 19, it says, "If only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied." So if Christ has not been raised, what Paul means, Christians are the greatest fools, and you are wasting your life more than anyone else. So this question has the greatest significance for us here. Was Jesus Christ raised from the dead? So what I want to do, I want to examine with you, look at with you this question. What evidence do we have that Jesus was raised? Isn't this really good for our hearts to consider, not just aimlessly guess or follow someone else's teaching? What do we think about the evidence? What evidence is there for Jesus' resurrection? Now, I say this evidence. I cannot give you proof here this morning. There's not some logical proof that I can give you. There's no science experiment. There's no mathematical equation that can give us solid proof here that's undoubtable. What we're doing is looking at evidence and trying to make conclusions, the best explanation of what happened in history. So this is actually very similar to being a detective and coming to a crime scene. A detective's not looking to replicate an experiment. They're not using a mathematical equation. They're analyzing the evidence that's been left behind to figure out the best explanation for what occurred. They're going to talk to eyewitnesses. They're going to look at belongings or things that have been left behind to examine what best explains all of this. And that's where they go. We're doing the same thing, being detectives here this morning, looking at the evidence that we have that can be established from history to say, what then best explains this? You following me? That's where we're going today. You with me? We're going to look at five explanations this morning for these stories that Jesus has been raised from the dead. Where does this come from? It's undoubtable. People are saying Jesus is raised. I don't think anyone's going to doubt that. We're here right now saying Jesus is raised. What explains this belief? 5 explanations. All right, here we go. Number 1, people say this is just a legend. Just a legend. What people usually mean by this is that Jesus was this great moral teacher. He's walking around Judea. He's a great rabbi. Then after his death, some decades, some centuries, there's people sitting around campfires talking about Jesus, and they slowly add detail to detail, and the legend grows, and then a couple centuries later, there's this whole story about Jesus being the Son of God raised from the dead, and it's written down, and Christians are just foolish enough to believe it, right? That's what many people in our culture believe. This is just a story that slowly grew over time and was put together by random people, and it was written down centuries later. Okay, what evidence do we have that might show us whether this is true or false? I want to look here again. This is 1 Corinthians, but first of all here, the earliest statements by Christians. Christians in the earliest moments are testifying that Jesus was raised from the dead. So the best evidence, the earliest statements that we have from followers of Jesus is that he was raised from the dead. There's no competing story that got changed. The earliest statements we have is, again, them saying Christ was raised. Here's this, again, from 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Paul says this, very fascinating. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance. Check this. That Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, still eyewitnesses is what Paul's saying, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born. Now, what's really fascinating about this passage from 1 Corinthians is the scholars show this is an early creedal statement. What do I mean by that? It's a short, concise, memorable statement that's supposed to be passed down for teaching. So if you're teaching a new follower of Jesus, you give them this creedal statement because it's easy to memorize, very short and succinct of the basic truths of Christianity. So it's meant to be memorable, short, early on teaching tool. You following me? Now, you could say, yeah, well, the thing is, like, this was made up centuries later. No, not so. Because we know this is from 1 Corinthians. Scholars point out this book was written in AD 53 to 55 AD. Can I say that again? AD 53 to AD 55. Now, that's not just some conservative Christian scholars. I mean, all scholars who are taken seriously at all say AD 53 to 55. That means we have a statement about Jesus being raised from the dead, a teaching tool being used in 20 years from his crucifixion. Do you get that? What's even more fascinating is because this is a teaching tool, Paul says, I received this, or I was taught this. Very likely, Paul was given this in AD 38 when he went to Jerusalem to meet with the apostles there. Now, this doesn't how Paul learned that Jesus was raised. He learned that in his own miraculous, stunning vision, seeing Christ raised as he was confronted by the living Christ on the Damascus road. Paul himself is a witness, as he said, I saw that Jesus is raised. But he got this teaching tool from the apostles in AD 38. So even within 5 years of Jesus being raised, there's good evidence that Christians are already teaching that Christ is alive. Even if you don't want to take AD 38, you got to stick with AD 55. No one else is taken seriously saying a different date. So from such an early time, when there were still eyewitnesses, this would have been confronted if it was false. The earliest teaching from Christians is that Jesus was raised. Wish we had time. It's the same in the biblical four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I'd love to take you through the evidence we have for why these are early eyewitness testimonies about Jesus' life and his resurrection. From the names to their awareness of the geography, these biblical accounts show they are trustworthy and they are speaking from eyewitnesses. So helpful. So as this legend grows, that's just not the timeline that fits. We see the earliest statements is that Jesus is raised from the dead. More than that, we see that Jesus' resurrection is not an idea that people would have come up with in this day. It's a phenomenal scholar named N.T. Wright that really has researched the ancient world and their ways of thinking, and he shows that neither Greeks nor Jews would have thought that this would happen. All were shocked by this. So for instance, Greeks, they thought the body that we have is not a good thing. It's a bad thing. So the soul inside is good. The body outside is unclean, dirty, not good, corrupted. So what they're looking for is to die and have their soul be free and back into a place of perfection. So someone to come along with a teaching saying, no, your soul's going to get back into a body, resurrected forever, Jesus, that was nonsense to the Greeks. The last thing they thought or wanted, so the Greeks wouldn't make this up. Same with the Jews. They did believe in a resurrection, but at the end of history. There was no category that there would be a private resurrection right in the middle of history. More than that this God-man would be worshipped, that's crazy to the Jews. So N.T. Wright lays out that if you think this is something that people just made up, you're not taking seriously the context of the world in the first century. This is not the way they thought. It was entirely unexpected. More than that, number 3, there are embarrassing details in these stories of Jesus' resurrection that would not have been included if they were made up. If you've ever heard about apologetics, this kind of talking about Jesus' resurrection, reasons to believe it, you've probably heard about the women being some of the first eyewitnesses at the tomb. The women were the first to see the angel. The women were the first to hear he's been raised. The women were the first to see the tomb is empty. This is massive because in the ancient world, in Greek and Jewish society, women's testimony wasn't taken seriously. That women's testimony wasn't even allowed in court. Women were not seen as reliable, so you had to have a man's testimony in court. Now, we might disagree, obviously, with this way of thinking, but you got to understand how the ancient world considered and looked at things. So if you're making up a story that you want people to believe about some guy getting raised from the dead, the last thing you're going to do is have women be the first witnesses of his resurrection. You following? The only reason you include this in the ancient world is because that's what actually happened. It's very difficult to explain if this is a legend and that it was made up. Why in the world are women the first eyewitnesses? That doesn't make any sense here. So this is very common in our culture. Just going to be honest with you. When I hear people say that this is what they think, it usually tells me they've just taken in things from movies and fictional books and they've never looked into it themselves. Whenever I hear people say this, they're just immediately announcing their ignorance of the actual evidence. If you're aware of the ancient world, textual evidence, you'd know this is not feasible at all. So if people realize it's not a legend that grew over time, what's another possible fit for this? Secondly, people say, okay, maybe not a legend. Maybe Jesus just passed out, the swoon theory, on the cross while he was being crucified. And then they took him down from the cross, they put him in the tomb, and in the cold of the tomb, he woke back up again, right? He comes out of the tomb, and people are like, oh my goodness, you're raised from the dead. You follow? That's what some people think. Now, I want to also address with this, in the Muslim world, they think that there was a swap and exchange. So at the last second, somebody was crucified in Jesus' place. And they died, and then Jesus comes out later alive, and people think he's resurrected. What do we make of these theories? Is that possible? First, I just want to look at this exchange real fast. We know again early on that there were many witnesses to Jesus' crucifixion, including his own family and enemies there. So crucifixions were purposefully very public by the Romans. They want to show people, hey, don't rebel against us, so we're going to do this publicly, right? Jesus was also a very well-known figure, so many people knew this was happening. They knew his face. But we also hear from all the accounts, Jesus' own mother was there at his crucifixion. So it's hard to see how somebody could be exchanged in his place without his own mom knowing it. You follow? More than that, actually. We know there's Jesus' enemies that are around him, sneering at him, scorning him. The Jewish leadership of the temple, they had been looking to get Jesus killed for a long time. They are excited about this. So they're not going to be okay with anybody being crucified in Jesus' place. And they know him well, have been interacting and debating with him for a long time, so they're not going to be fooled. Just in case maybe Jesus is so disfigured they didn't realize that they could disfigure this other guy, we also have Jesus saying things from the cross that make no sense for anyone else to say. Him giving his mother to one of his disciples, saying, "Disciple, this is now your mother." Why would anyone do that in place of Jesus? More than that, when we see later people say that Jesus is raised, they see him raised with crucifixion marks in his hands and in his feet. So if it's a swap, then you got Jesus still being partially crucified, right? And people in on the plot, which we're going to address later. You following me? This just does not work, that someone was exchanged for Jesus. Secondly here, though, maybe Jesus just passed out on the cross. You guys sticking with me? There's a lot of information we're going through, but hang with me. Maybe Jesus passed out on the cross and then woke up later in the tomb. Now, this is not really taking seriously what happens in a crucifixion. Now, first of all, when the Romans were going to crucify somebody, they first flogged them. Probably heard a little bit, there's going to be some gruesome details, but I think it's helpful to share it with you. The Romans had a certain type of whip where there's these leather threads, and they put really sharp bones tied into the leather threads, and then weighted metal balls on each strand, so there'd be more momentum and more power and impact when they swung the whip. And this whip would then dive into their flesh, these bones and sharp glass, and they pulled it out of their flesh. So when they're flogging someone, they're actually just ripping out skin and slowly getting into muscle. Ancient witnesses say they'd expose the ribs, you'd expose the spine. Eusebius, one early church historian, talks about how sometimes this whip would wrap around to their gut and it would expose their bowels. It's opening up their body. So many people died by flogging before they ever got crucified. This was so brutal. What also happened to people when they've been flogged is they go into hypovolemic shock, which is just a medical term talking about shock from blood loss. What happens to your body is that your heart starts to beat a lot more quickly because it's trying to get blood that's not there to the rest of the body. You follow? Also, when you have this loss of blood, your blood pressure drops, so you more easily pass out and you more easily go unconscious. You begin to lay down, just to collapse. Thirdly, what happens is that people, they get so craving for liquid because their body is trying to replenish the blood loss, so they get really, really thirsty. Does that remind you of Jesus at all? Carrying his own cross to Golgotha, he collapses. On the cross, he cries out, "I'm thirsty." He's in hypovolemic shock from the blood loss. We'll say, well, maybe doesn't that prove that he passed out? Not so, because we've not even gotten to the crucifixion part yet. It's helpful to see how Jesus died. Secondly here, when we look at how Jesus was crucified, it better fits him dying than him passing out, the evidence we have. For instance, when someone was crucified by the Romans, they would put nails, not actually through the hands, like a lot of people think, because you'd more easily rip right out from your body weight. They put it through the wrist bones, right in the median nerve right there, so your whole arm would be on fire. They'd also put nails through your ankle bones. There have been skeletons discovered in Judea that have been crucified that still have the nail in the ankle bones with wood there. So we know the Romans used nails to crucify their victims. So when they've been nailed up, the way they died is actually not just hanging there, but actually suffocation, because they had to pull themselves up to breathe. The weight of their body wouldn't allow them to take in a breath. So every time you wanted to breathe, you had to go through excruciating pain, pulling down on your wrists and pushing up with your feet on those nails so that you could finally get a breath. This went on for days for some people. That's why crucifixion is excruciating and where we get that word. What happens, though, as well, is you're struggling to breathe. You're not getting enough oxygen in you. You start to have too much carbon dioxide. This leads, as medical people talk about, blood acidosis, where there's too much carbon dioxide in your blood. What this eventually leads to is an irregular heart rhythm. You start to have these heart murmurs and your heart pace changes and can lead to cardiac arrest. It's why it seems that Jesus knew he was about to die. He could feel his heart failing, why he cries out, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." This also makes sense because if you have this kind of cardiac arrest, there's a fluid, water-like fluid that builds up in the membrane around your heart and also in the membrane around your lungs. So it says in John, when the soldiers took the spear and speared him through the side, John says blood and water flowed out. Now it's a really weird detail. That's why John shares it. It's like, this is super odd. Like you think just blood would come out. But he's like, I saw water come out and blood. He's like, I testify this is true. Now we know medically why this would happen. This really fits with cardiac arrest and this water-like fluid that builds up around the heart and the lungs. This shows how Jesus died is actually very likely cardiac arrest from lacking oxygen and his hypovolemic shock. Do you follow this? It fits not passing out, but his death. More than that, though, Romans were highly motivated to make sure the person they were crucifying actually died. Otherwise, they would die in their place. Talk about motivation. If I got to make sure you're dead, otherwise I'm dying. So these Roman soldiers were experts making sure people were killed. This is why we see in all the stories of the crucifixion, when it's time to bring the bodies down, they're not taking any chances. They first go to the two criminals on Jesus' either side and they break the leg bones so that they wouldn't be able to push up anymore to breathe. That just makes the body hang and they quickly suffocate. When they get to Jesus, they see that he's already dead. But again, these are Roman soldiers. They don't do guesswork. That's why they take the spear in order to plunge it into his heart, into his side. So that's why they're ensuring there is zero chance anyone's surviving crucifixion. N.T. Wright, again, this great scholar on the resurrection, he points out this is not a view that really any scholar takes today. Let me read N.T. Wright here. He says, "The hoary old theory that Jesus did not really die on the cross, but revived in the cool of the tomb has likewise nothing to recommend it. And it is noticeable that even those historians who are passionately committed to denying the resurrection do not attempt to go by this route. Roman soldiers, after all, were rather good at killing people, and when given a rebel leader to practice on, they would have had several motives for making sure the job was done properly." So honestly, I mean, this kind of gets thrown out, but nobody actually really takes this seriously, that Jesus didn't die on the cross. So what else do people say? Thirdly, here, people say that they got the tomb wrong. That maybe Jesus was buried in one spot, but when the women come later in the early morning, they follow the wrong directions, They go to the wrong tomb, they walk in and nobody's there and they're all like, whoa, Jesus is raised, the empty tomb. Or maybe with this, that disciples came and they stole the tomb in order to create this conspiracy that Jesus was alive. What do we make of this? Now, first of all, this is super easily corrected, particularly if the women got the wrong tomb. So we know as Christianity got going and people were preaching that Jesus was raised from the dead, it's not like everyone was excited about this. There was great resistance to this, particularly from the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem. So it would have been very easy if they got the wrong tomb just to say, hello everybody, here is the right tomb and here's the body. End of story, no more Christianity. You follow? So not very likely. Far more often people say Jesus' disciples stole the body. This also runs into a problem though. We know from history that all of Jesus' 12 disciples died for their testimony about Jesus. Let's consider this. Why would his disciples suffer massively and lose their lives if they knew it was a lie? Why would they commit themselves to this blasphemy as Jews against God and then die for this lie? That makes no sense at all. More than that, again, N.T. Wright shows this is not the kind of thinking, this conspiratorial thinking. Let's say Jesus was raised from the dead. That's just not the way Jews thought. That's not at all something that would come up in their mind. Resurrection in this moment of history was not a category that they had. Let me read again here. This is N.T. Wright. He says this. In not one single case, this is other Messiah moments in the first century, Jesus is not the only one claiming to be the Messiah. Many others that came up. He says, in not one single case do we hear the slightest mention of the disappointed followers claiming that their hero had been raised from the dead. They knew better. Resurrection was not a private event. Jewish revolutionaries, whose leader had been executed by the authorities and who managed to escape arrest themselves, had two options: give up the revolution or find another leader. Claiming the original leader was alive again was simply not an option, unless, of course, he was. This is what N.T. Wright's showing. This is not a category of thought they had. Nowhere else in the first century with many other Messiah movements do we see anything like this. The only reason we can see is because actually they experienced something. Fourthly here, though, with the empty tomb, this also doesn't make sense for why so many people say they saw Jesus alive, that he appeared to them. Why would they say this? The empty tomb, again, this is so easily corrected. If someone's saying, hey, let's check that here, actually, right? This is easily disproved. Let's go to his tomb. Oh, you're wrong. He's not alive, right? So people are saying this happened can only be because there's an empty tomb. All right, fourthly here, what's the other option? The other explanation people use is that there's just this hallucination, this group think that's going on among his disciples. So something like this today, people say, the disciples missed Jesus terribly. They were in such massive grief about him dying, their brains couldn't handle it. And so they started to hallucinate and just create this story together that Jesus was raised from the dead. They convinced themselves. This great book, Lee Strobel, called The Case for Christ. He interviews a psychologist named Gary Collins about the possibility of this. There's hallucinations, perhaps, the disciples had. This is Gary Collins, a well-renowned psychologist. He says this, is this hallucinations. He says, hallucinations are individual occurrences. By their very nature, only one person can see a hallucination at a time. They certainly aren't something which can be seen by a group of people. Neither is it possible that one person could somehow induce a hallucination in someone else. Since a hallucination exists only in this subjective personal sense, it is obvious that others can't witness it. So clearly here, he's saying hallucinations might happen for one person, but this is not something spreadable, that over 500 people would be saying that they've seen Jesus raised. Not a contagious thing. More than that, actually very importantly here, it's not just followers of Jesus. We actually see those who are opposed to Jesus are also testifying he's alive. Those who are highly interested in him staying in the grave are also saying, I've seen him alive. One of these is Jesus' own brother named James, who was not a follower of Jesus until he saw him alive. James became one of the critical early leaders in the church. So he's highly invested in staying right, not in being proved wrong. Even more so, we've talked about him already, the Apostle Paul. He is highly engaged, working to persecute the early church. And it's on a road to Damascus that he is challenged by the alive Lord Jesus. Paul has zero interest in convincing himself of a hallucination or joining groupthink. How do we explain why so many enemies of Jesus also became his followers? Something happened. We also see often here in the gospel accounts, the disciples are shocked when they hear about Jesus being raised. They're full of skepticism and resistance. Y'all talking nonsense, right? They say to the women. Or Thomas, when he hears about Jesus being raised, he says, I'm not going to believe you unless I see the nail marks in his hands. Unless I put my finger there, unless I put my hand into his side, I will not believe. So any testimony, early writings about Jesus and his resurrection, we see that disciples are not eager to think he's alive. They're very resistant and skeptical to him being alive. Again, what do we make of all these appearances? It does not fit hallucination or groupthink. So I want you to consider, what do you think about the resurrection? Let me just lay out for us briefly here the evidence we've so far covered that any serious historian believes is true that we have to wrestle with. First of all, the earliest teaching we have from Christians is that Jesus was raised. This is their earliest statements. You want to look at the best evidence? What were Christians saying? People following Jesus right off the bat? Is it that he's just a moral teacher, just a human being? No, that's not it. They're saying he's the Son of God raised in power. That's the earliest statements we have. Secondly, Any serious historian will let you know there's an empty tomb. Nothing else makes sense of this movement. Thirdly, we have many people saying that Jesus has appeared to them. This is, again, not opinion. I want you to grab this. Any serious historian is going to tell you this is what happened. They don't know why it happened, but they're saying people were saying Jesus appeared to them. So we need to find some explanation for that, no matter what you think. You following me? So this is not my opinion that this is the case. This is just historical fact. People were saying Jesus appeared to them. That's what historians will tell you, any good scholar. Fourthly here, Christianity exploded in the midst of severe persecution all over the Roman world. People believed this, followed this, died for this. What leads to this kind of passionate testimony for this to grow all over the Jewish, Greek, and Roman world? So I'm just going to lay this question before you that I had earlier today. What do you think happened on that first Easter morning? What do you think explains this evidence? Now, I know what a lot of people are tempted to do is just to say, well, I don't know, Caleb, but anything's more likely than Jesus raising from the dead, right? It could be any kind of crazy, weird theory, conspiracy thing that's still going to make more sense than someone being raised from the dead, because that's impossible. Now, Tim Keller, he says, this is actually the same challenge people in the first century had. People in the first century also thought anything's more likely than Jesus being raised. The reason they started to believe is because they were convinced by the evidence. So in the same way, if your view of the world leads you to say that it's not possible, although that's the best explanation, how much evidence does it take before you begin to question your view of the world? How much evidence do you need before you start to question what is possible? That's what people did in the first century to wrestle with. I'm hearing this, although it seems impossible, there's nothing else that explains the evidence that we have. So wrestle here with me this morning. What do you think about Jesus? And if you connect these dots and begin to say, I see he really did die. I believe there really is an empty tomb. I believe these early accounts are actually trustworthy from eyewitnesses. I see this is not groupthink, but people actually saw Jesus. They were convinced of that. What explains all of this? What is the thing that ties together all of this evidence? Jesus Christ was raised in power by God from the grave. Jesus defeated death and is the living Lord over the entire universe. That's the one thing that explains everything. I mean, even more than this. Can you tell me why millions of people throughout church history have just been stunningly changed by this person named Jesus? Can we just add that to the evidence as well? What explains all of this? Shockingly, beautifully enough, he's actually alive. And he's actually aware of us here. He's actually reigning right now. And he's actually coming back for his people. So praise God, we can now say the most beautiful things that could ever be true are true. And I don't want you to be fools. I don't want you to close your eyes and just blindly believe. I'm asking you to consider deeply and to use the minds and the reason God has given you. We believe because there's such good evidence. Jesus, you are alive, and we praise you and we honor you. I'm going to invite our communion team to get up and our worship team as well. We take communion each week as a reminder of the gospel. I want to do that again today, but in a little different sense. I want you to come forward and take communion as a statement of your trust and affirmation that this Lord who is the body broken and the blood poured out is alive today. So you're saying, I'm partaking of your death because I believe you are alive. So I just want you to examine your hearts right now. If you're kind of new to this, just exploring Jesus, just want you to think, Lord, what do I really believe about you? What's maybe hindering me in my life from actually believing this? I just want you to be honest. It's probably not reason or your intelligence. It's probably your love for something else in your life that makes you not want to believe that Jesus is raised. What is it that's holding you back? If you are following Jesus, I want you to just bring your heart before him and confess here. How are you not living in line with this truth? How's your life not matching the hope of the resurrection? Just want you to confess that here. So take time in silence either to confess your unbelief or to recognize how you're not living in line with this.